When a cold-hearted mafia boss refuses to thank the black maid who saved his only son, his arrogance seems untouchable. But when Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock start digging, they uncover a buried truth that shakes his entire crime empire. Until the man who bowed to no one is forced to beg forgiveness from the woman he tried to erase. The night Grace became invisible. Victor Morty's house did not look like a place where people bled. It was marble and gold, crystal chandeliers and silent hallways, the kind of mansion where fear wore perfume and walked on soft carpets. The staff moved like shadows, especially the maid in the black uniform with the white collar, Grace Thompson, who carried other people's secrets the way she carried their laundry, quietly and without dropping anything. To Victor, she was just another pair of hands. To his 8-year-old son, Luca, she was the only adult in the house who ever knelt to his height and actually listened. That evening began with the usual rituals of power. Men in suits came and went with cases they did not open in the light. Victor took calls in 3 languages, his voice always low and steady, the sound of a man who believed nothing and no one could touch him. In the kitchen, Grace stirred a pot of soup for Luca, humming an old hymn under her breath, the same one her grandmother had sung through storms and power cuts back in Georgia. She had worked for the Mortys for just over a year, long enough to know where the panic rooms were and short enough to still flinch at the way armed guards decorated the hallways. The first sign that the night would break all its rules was so small Grace almost ignored it. A flicker in the kitchen lights, just a shiver, and then darkness. The generator kicked in a second later, but it was enough time for the house to go suddenly, unnaturally quiet. No humming from the giant fridges, no click of distant heels on marble, only Luca's small voice behind her, trembling. "Grace, why did it get so dark?" Before she could answer, the sound came, distant at first, then closer, like someone kicking a metal door from the inside. 1, 2, 3 dull thuds from the back entrance, answered by shouted orders in the hallway in the harsh, panicked Italian she had learned to recognize as danger. Grace did not know the details of Victor's world, but she knew what that sound meant. People were coming who did not knock politely. Her hands moved on their own. She grabbed Luca's arm, the spoon clattering to the floor, and yanked him down behind the heavy kitchen island just as glass exploded somewhere down the corridor. Gunfire did not sound like it did in movies. It was sharper, crueler, a series of cracks that seemed to tear the air itself. Luca screamed, a high, thin sound that made her chest burn. She wrapped her arms around him, trying to make her body a wall, her mind racing through the emergency briefing she had been given on her first day and hoped never to use. If anything ever happens, the boy goes to the safe room. You don't stop. You don't argue, you run. No one had mentioned what to do if the hallway to the safe room turned into a war zone. The kitchen door burst open. One of Victor's guards stumbled in, blood on his sleeve, eyes wild. "They're inside," he hissed, then saw Grace and the boy. "Move now!" He didn't get another word out. A bullet caught him in the side of the head, and he dropped so fast his body seemed to vanish before it hit the tiles. The shooter in the doorway turned his gun toward the sound of Luca's sobbing. Grace did not think about courage. She did not weigh the odds. Her grandmother's hymn broke off mid-note inside her throat as she grabbed the cast-iron skillet from the stove and hurled it with everything she had. It slammed into the man's wrist with a sick, ringing crack. He swore. The shot went wild, punching a hole in the ceiling instead of a child's chest. Grace seized Luca's hand and bolted, dragging him over the fallen guard's body, boots slipping in blood she tried not to see. The hallway was chaos, shouting in 2 directions, men she recognized by their suits but not their faces, firing behind overturned furniture. Victor was nowhere in sight. Grace kept her head down, heart pounding so hard it felt like it was trying to escape her ribs. "Don't look, baby, don't look," she whispered to Luca, even as his small fingers dug into her palm. A second gunman turned toward them, eyes narrowing when he saw the boy. She didn't stop running. Her own scream surprised her as she barreled into him with her whole weight, using momentum and terror as weapons. He stumbled, hit the wall, and fired. Heat tore across her upper arm, a white-hot slice that made her hand go numb, but she did not let go of Luca. They fell together, then scrambled back up, her vision swimming. A guard from Victor's side took the gunman down with 3 brutal shots. The man never saw who saved the heir he had come to steal. By the time they reached the door of the safe room, Grace's lungs burned and Luca was crying so hard his words came out broken. "Daddy, I want my dad. Grace, it hurts. My ears hurt." She slammed her good shoulder into the biometric panel, praying someone inside had kept the system online. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the steel door hissed open, and there he was, Victor Morty, sleeves rolled up, gun in his hand, face pale in a way she had never seen. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met. Grace's vision tunneled. Victor was not the untouchable man from the news, not the ruthless boss whose orders made entire neighborhoods flinch. He was just a father whose world had been hanging by a thread for the last 5 minutes. She shoved Luca forward with the last of her strength. "Your son," she gasped. "Take your son." Victor grabbed the boy, pulling him into his chest. The sound that came out of him was raw and animal, a broken groan of relief. His gun clattered to the floor as he wrapped both arms around Luca, burying his face in the child's hair. Over his shoulder, Grace swayed, suddenly lightheaded. The hallway tilted. The blood soaking her sleeve finally made sense to her brain. One of Victor's men rushed forward, catching her under the arms before she collapsed completely. Sirens wailed in the distance. The gunfire had stopped. The house, moments ago a battlefield, was already starting to do what rich houses do best: cover its own violence with polished silence. Medics would come. Bodies would be removed. Walls would be repaired. Stories would be rewritten. But in that first quiet moment after the storm, there was one truth hanging in the charged air between them. Without Grace, Victor would be holding a dead child. He did not say thank you. Instead, he pulled away from Luca just enough to look at her, his expression rearranging itself like a mask slipping back into place. His eyes swept over her uniform, the blood, the dark skin, the trembling legs that had just carried his future through hell. Something hard and familiar settled in his features, a cold calculation that pushed gratitude aside. "Get her patched up," he told his men, voice flat. "Then send her home. She won't be coming back." Grace stared at him, stunned, as if the words were in a language she didn't know. "Sir, I'm your employee. I can't just—" "You're finished here," Victor cut in, not raising his voice, which somehow made it worse. "You did your job. You were paid to protect this household. That's all." His gaze flicked to the smear of Luca's tears on her blouse, then away again, as if the sight offended him. "There is no debt." In that instant, something inside Grace cracked, not loud like gunfire, but quiet and deep, the sound of a bridge giving way. She had thrown her body in front of bullets for a man who could not shape two simple words with his mouth. Her arm throbbed. Her pride bled in a place no bandage could reach. She wanted to scream at him, to list every night she had sat with his son through nightmares he hadn't noticed, every gentle correction when Luca parroted the cruel language he heard from guards. Instead, she swallowed it just as she had swallowed so many things in this house. Her voice, when it came, was hoarse. "Yes, sir." As they led her away, Luca fought to break free from his father's grip. "No, I want Grace. She saved me. Dad, tell her she can stay." The boy's desperation echoed down the corridor, bouncing off the marble like a verdict. Victor held him tighter, jaw clenched so hard a vein stood out in his neck. He did not answer his son. He did not look at the woman who had carried that boy through fire. Hours later, after the medics stitched her arm and handed her a plastic bag with her blood-streaked uniform, Grace walked out of the mansion with a cardboard box of her belongings. The house loomed behind her, lights blazing as if to insist nothing had really happened. A car waited at the curb to take her away quietly, the way the Mortys preferred to dispose of problems. She paused, turning back for one last look at the window of Luca's room, wondering if he was awake, if he thought she had abandoned him. What none of them knew was that the mansion had one witness Victor had forgotten. A tiny security camera mounted high in the corner of the kitchen. Its lens cracked, but still recording when Grace hurled that skillet and took a bullet for a child who wasn't hers. The footage, pulled from a backup server by a low-level tech who couldn't sleep after the attack, had already left the house on a flash drive tucked into an old leather jacket. Across the city, in a small, cluttered office that didn't match the faces inside it, a man with tired eyes and a familiar, gentle intensity pressed pause on a grainy video frame of Grace shielding Luca with her own body. Beside him, a woman leaned in, her sharp gaze locked on Victor's expression the moment the safe room door opened. "Look at his face, right there," she murmured, voice low but electric. "That's not just fear. He knows her. He's hiding something." Keanu Reeves hit rewind, his jaw tightening. Sandra Bullock folded her arms, never taking her eyes off the screen. In that frozen image, A maid bleeding, a boy sobbing, a mafia boss torn open for just a heartbeat. They both saw the beginning of a story the world was not supposed to hear. And before the sun came up, they had already decided they were going to tell it. The woman they tried to erase. Grace woke up screaming before the sound reached her throat. Her body jolted upright in the darkness of her small apartment, breath tearing in and out, her injured arm pulsing with that old phantom heat. For a second she was back in the kitchen, smelling gunpowder and metal and spilled soup. Then the room came into focus, peeling paint, a crooked curtain rod, the low hum of traffic 4 floors below. No chandeliers, no guards, no Luca. She pressed the heel of her hand to her eyes, willing the images to fade. Beside the bed, a plastic pharmacy bag held her painkillers and the cheap ointment she had bought after the hospital sent her home. The discharge papers called the bullet wound minor. The doctor had not seen the way Grace's hands shook when a car backfired outside. Trauma did not show up on X-rays. By day, she moved through the city like a ghost. She stood in long lines at employment offices, her sling drawing curious glances she pretended not to notice. She filled out forms that asked for references she no longer had, work history she could not fully explain. "Domestic staff for a private family," she wrote, leaving the name Morty off the page the way you leave mold off a real estate listing. At night, she counted crumpled bills on the table, calculating how many weeks of rent she had left before the landlord's patience ran out. Only one thing made her hands still, a small blue paper plane resting on the shelf above the kitchen sink. Luca had folded it on a slow afternoon, his tongue stuck out in concentration, then launched it down the hallway until a guard snapped at him to stop. Before bed, he had pressed it into her palm. "So you can fly away if you want," he'd whispered, as if the walls had ears. Grace kept it like a relic. Now, in the silence of her apartment, she sometimes caught herself talking to it, as if the boy could hear her through the paper. "I didn't leave you," she would murmur. "They sent me away." Across town, Keanu rewound the security footage for the 3rd time, his tired eyes locked on the screen. The cheap office chair creaked as he leaned forward, elbows on his knees. The room smelled of coffee and old dust and freshly printed paper. It looked more like a student film set than the workspace of 2 world-famous actors. That was exactly how they wanted it. Fame worked like a spotlight. For this, they needed shadows. Sandra stood behind him, arms folded, jaw tightened in that way that meant her mind was 3 moves ahead. "The way she moves," she said quietly, watching Grace shield Luca with her injured arm. "That's not training, that's instinct, like she's done this before, just not with guns." Keanu nodded slowly. "And look at Victor. He knows exactly who she is. That's not surprise on his face when he sees her, it's recognition." He hit pause at the frame where Victor's gaze hardened, where something warm flickered and then shut down. Something's wrong here. He should be on his knees thanking her. Instead, he fires her like a problem to be solved. The low-level tech who'd brought them the flash drive shifted uneasily in the corner. "Mr. Reeves, I just thought, you guys did that documentary on prison reform, and you said to call if I ever saw something that didn't sit right. The official report already says 1 guard got Luca to the safe room. No mention of her at all. They erased her name from the incident log." Sandra turned. "Does anyone else know about this footage?" He shook his head. "If they do, they're not talking. The Mortys are cleaning everything up fast. Their lawyer's already spinning it as a targeted attack by a rival. The Maid, she's a ghost." Keanu's gaze shifted to the corkboard on the wall, already filling with printed screenshots. Grace's blurred face, the mansion exterior, a clipping about Victor's charitable foundation for underprivileged youth. He ran a hand through his hair and exhaled slowly. "Then we find her," he said. "We put her back in the story where she belongs." For the next week, their lives shrank to a single question. Who is Grace Thompson? Assistants made quiet calls, avoiding official channels. Sandra combed through staff registries and tax records herself, squinting at lists of names until they blurred. Keanu met with a lawyer friend in a corner booth of a noisy diner, talking in low tones about whistleblower protections and defamation law. They knew one thing very clearly: exposing a mafia boss was not a performance. There would be no second take. The first real lead came from a place so ordinary it felt like fate showing off. A woman at a small cleaning agency remembered Grace's calm voice and perfect references. Polite, always on time, sent most of her pay back home. she said over the phone. "Last I heard, she took a live-in job in the hills. Rich family. After that, nothing. Why? Is she in trouble?" Sandra opened her mouth to say she saved a child and got punished for it, but stopped herself. "We're just trying to make sure she's okay," she replied instead. The woman hesitated, then dug through an old file and read out an address Grace had used before taking the live-in position. That evening, as the sun bled out behind the buildings, Grace stood at her window staring down at the street, wondering how long before she had to pawn the tiny gold cross that had been her mother's. The city moved under her, unaware she was standing at the edge of a cliff. She pressed her fingers to the aching scar on her arm and made herself a quiet promise. No matter what happened, she would not go back to that house and beg. She had already given them more of herself than they deserved. A car door slammed below, footsteps on the stairwell. Voices, one low and familiar from movie trailers, the other bright with that warm, slightly teasing edge she recognized from late-night talk shows playing in the background while she folded expensive shirts that weren't hers. Grace frowned. Her neighbors liked their music loud, but their conversations private. This was different. There was a soft knock at her door. No heavy pounding like collectors, no jangle of keys like the landlord. Just 3 gentle taps, as if the person outside believed she had the right to choose whether to answer. She almost didn't. Then, against her better judgment, Grace opened the door a crack and froze. Keanu Reeves stood in the dim hallway, hands empty, eyes careful. Beside him, Sandra Bullock offered a small, uncertain smile, the kind people use when they come carrying news that could change your life or break it apart. "Ms. Thompson?" Keanu asked quietly, as if he already knew she hated loud voices now. "We're sorry to bother you. We need to talk to you about what happened in that house." For the first time since the night of the attack, Grace felt the world tilt in a direction she hadn't prepared for. All her old stories about who mattered and who didn't suddenly seem too small for the moment waiting in her doorway. Her first instinct was to slam the door. Instead, she just stood there, hand on the knob, torn between the safety of silence and the strange, terrifying possibility that someone had finally come to say the words Victor refused to speak. The choice hovered between them, heavy and fragile, as the hallway light flickered once and buzzed back to life. The price of telling the truth. Grace let them in, but only halfway. She left the chain on the door, the short length of metal, a thin line of control in a life that had spun out of her hands. Keanu stayed a respectful distance back. Sandra shifted so Grace could see both their faces clearly, no sudden movements, no crowding. It felt less like a celebrity encounter and more like an emergency room, everyone speaking in careful tones so the patient wouldn't bolt. "You shouldn't be here," Grace said at last, her voice rough from disuse. "If you know anything about that family, you know people who get close to their business tend to disappear." Sandra's eyes softened. "We didn't come for their business," she replied. "We came because we saw something they're trying to bury. We saw you." She glanced at Keanu, then back at Grace. "You carried that boy through gunfire, and officially you don't exist." The words hit harder than they were probably meant to. Grace's breath caught. She thought of the incident report she hadn't been allowed to read, the way Victor's lawyer had smiled without warmth as he shoved her severance papers across the table. "The incident is over," he'd said. "For your own safety, you will not discuss it with anyone." "What do you want from me?" she asked quietly. Keanu reached into his jacket, slow and deliberate, and pulled out a small tablet. "We'd like you to watch something," he said. "If you can." When she hesitated, he added, "You're in control here. You can tell us to leave at any time." Something in his tone, no pressure, no rush, made her unhook the chain. She opened the door fully and stepped back, motioning them inside. The apartment looked even smaller with 2 more bodies in it, but she suddenly saw it through their eyes. The carefully made bed, the clipped coupons on the counter, the single blue paper plane on the shelf. Sandra's gaze lingered on it for a moment, a faint sadness passing through her features, but she didn't comment. Grace sat at the small kitchen table. Her hand trembled slightly as she took the tablet. Keanu tapped the screen and the footage began. The kitchen, the pot of soup, the first flicker of the lights. There she was, moving in jerky pixels, grabbing Luca, ducking behind the island. She watched herself hurl the skillet, watched the guard die, watched her own body jerk as the bullet grazed her arm. I didn't know there was a camera in that corner, she whispered. They didn't either, Sandra said. The main system got wiped. This was from an old backup unit still online. You weren't meant to see this. No one was. The video reached the safe room door. Grace's throat tightened when she saw the look on Victor's face again, this time from the outside, as if she were watching a stranger's disaster. She heard herself say, "Your son, take your son." She watched him take the boy, cry into his hair like any father would, and then turn to ice. When he said, "You're finished here," Grace hit pause. Silence filled the room, thick and buzzing. Her chair scraped softly as she pushed back from the table. She walked to the sink on unsteady legs, gripping the counter until her knuckles blanched. "I knew he didn't thank me," she said slowly. "I remember every second of that, but seeing it like this, it's like proof that I wasn't crazy for feeling erased." Keanu leaned forward, forearms on his knees. "You're not crazy," he said. "You were erased on purpose." His official statement credits one of his security team for getting Luca to safety. The man who died in your kitchen. They gave him a medal. They started a scholarship in his name. He hesitated. "There isn't one word about you." Sandra added, "And it's not just forgetting. It's strategy. A story about a loyal guard dying in the line of duty is clean. A story about a black maid saving the air while his father hides in a safe room." She shook her head. "That threatens his image, his control. It rearranges who the hero is." Grace let out a short, humorless laugh. "So he'd rather honor a dead man than thank the woman who's still breathing." "He'd rather no one know he owed you anything at all," Sandra said gently. For a long moment, Grace stared at the blue paper plane on the shelf. She thought of Luca's letters, imaginary ones, because he couldn't write to her without his father's permission. In her mind, they stacked up anyway, a pile of unwritten apologies from a boy who had nothing to apologize for. "What happens if this gets out?" she asked. "That video, my name, him." Keanu exchanged a look with Sandra before answering. "If we do this right, people hear the truth. They see your courage. They see what he did, both what he allowed in his house and how he treated you afterward. He'll deny, he'll threaten, he'll send lawyers. But there's a chance, a real chance, that the story becomes bigger than his reach." "And if you don't do it right," Grace pressed. "Then he makes our lives very complicated," Sandra said plainly, "and yours very dangerous." The honesty landed like a weight between them. No sugarcoating, no promises they couldn't keep. Grace found she preferred it that way. She had worked too long in a house built of pretty lies. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, turning to face them fully. "You could walk away. You could pretend you never saw that footage. Go shoot another movie, make people laugh, cry, whatever it is you do. Why risk it for me?" Keanu's answer came slowly, as if he'd been turning it over in his head long before she asked. "Because we've both played heroes on screen," he said. "And we both know how much of that is editing and lighting and good dialogue. You, on the other hand, did something brave when nobody was watching. They tried to cut you out of the story. That doesn't sit right with me." Sandra nodded. "And because we've both seen what happens when powerful men get to write the only version of events. You deserve your own chapter, even if it's messy, even if it scares us." Grace looked down at her hands at the faint white line where the bullet had kissed her skin. Fear crawled up her spine. She pictured Victor finding out she'd talked, pictured that cold look in his eyes locking onto her again. But under the fear, another feeling stirred, thin, unfamiliar, and stubborn. Anger. Not the wild kind that burned everything in its path, but the steady kind that held your head up when someone tried to push it down. "What if I say no?" she asked. "What if I decide surviving is enough?" "Then we leave," Keanu said at once. "We destroy the footage, we walk away, and we'll carry that choice with us, not you." He leaned back, giving her space. "We're not here to use you. We're here to offer you a microphone. You decide if you want to speak into it." The room went quiet again. Outside, a siren wailed past, then faded. Somewhere above them, a baby started crying. A dog barked in response. Life, messy and loud and oblivious, went on. Grace thought of her grandmother sitting on a worn porch swing in Georgia, Bible on her lap, saying, "Baby, sometimes silence is safety, but sometimes it's another kind of prison." She thought of Luca's terrified grip on her hand, the way he'd yelled, "Tell her she can stay," while his father looked away. Slowly, she walked back to the table and sat down. Her heart thudded in her ears. "If I do this," she said carefully, "it has to be the whole story, not just the night of the shooting. People need to know who he is the other 6 days of the week, what that house does to the people who live in it, and," she swallowed hard, "and what he did to my family before I ever put on that uniform." Sandra's eyebrows lifted. Before. Grace met her gaze, something fierce flickering through her fatigue. "You think the worst thing Victor ever did to me was refuse to say thank you," she said quietly. "No, that was just the last straw." Keanu straightened, all his attention focused on her now. "Grace," he asked, voice gentle but intent, "what did he do?" She held his gaze for a long moment, the old wound she'd kept sealed for years pressing against its own fragile walls. Her fingers curled around the edge of the table. When she finally spoke, her words were soft, but they carried the weight of another life. "Before I was his maid," she said, "I was the sister of the man he had killed." The room seemed to shrink around them. The little apartment, the table, the tablet with the frozen image of Victor on the screen. Everything tightened around that single revelation, humming with a new, dangerous electricity. Outside, footsteps passed in the hallway, then paused right outside Grace's door. A shadow moved under the crack, lingering there as if someone on the other side was listening, or deciding whether to knock.